Yes, that's right.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for yet another edition of our fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons, and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, Germany. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me say a few words about who IRENA is and what we aim to do with our webinar series. So IRENA is an intergovernmental organization. We have currently 168 member countries, and another 16 countries are in their accession process. We support countries in their transition to sustainable energy future. And we serve as the principal platform for international collaboration, a center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. And because our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that was the main reason why we launched this webinar series, which we run every other week, usually on Tuesdays. And we started it back in January 2020, so before pandemics proliferated, many virtual events. So far, we organized over 40 webinars on various topics, and you can check them all on our IRENA events website. The link to that will be also in our presentation slide. So we appreciated that there are many other longer deep dive workshop or webinars out there, but what we are trying to do here is on contrary to keep these webinars short. So they last approximately 30 minutes, which means we clearly cannot cover everything, but the idea is to give you enough to decide whether you want to actually delve deeper into the topic. And we signpost in our presentations further sources of more in-depth information to help you to do that. Next slide, please. So today, while you enjoy your coffee, tea, or bagel, in the next 30 minutes or so, I'm very excited to say that we are going to hear from our costing experts, Pablo Ralón and Sonia Alozugul. They will share with us findings from their latest 2021 analysis of renewable power generation cost. And we already had two previous editions when they shared it with us in 2020 and also in 2021. IRENA's cost analysis program has been collecting and reporting the cost and performance data of renewable power generation technology since 2012. And the data and analysis are based on the IRENA renewable cost database that has data on around 21,000 renewable power generation projects from around the world. And colleagues have some exciting insight today to share with you. But before I hand over the microphone to Pablo and Sonia, just very briefly, a few housekeeping items, which you certainly all are aware of from all the other online events. So we are recording the webinar, and we will be posting the recording and also the slides on IRENA events website within the next 48 hours. You're all on mute. If you have questions to us, you can either use the Q&A function, and if we have time, we will try to answer them. Otherwise, we encourage you to use cost@irena.org email, and I will also post it in the chat. And well, without any further ado, let me welcome Pablo and Sonia. Guys, welcome, and over to you. And next slide.
Well, hello, thank you, Martina. And yeah, it's a pleasure to come to have this opportunity again to share some of the insights of this renewable power generation cost report for this year. Michael cannot join us this time, he's on sick leave, but maybe next year he will. So just some of the key findings of the report, just to get it. This report is, by the way, is available online as all IRENA reports, so you can download it as well from our website. So around 73% of the new utility scale capacity in 2021 was cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel option. So this is becoming increasingly higher every year, in fact. And here you can see a chart of the LCOE of all renewable energy technologies that we're tracking. In some cases, you see some dramatic reduction of around 80%, for example, for solar PV. But increasingly also renewables undercutting the fossil fuel cost range at the LCOE level. So that is something that also the competitiveness of renewables has been increasing continuously in the last decade, often dramatically. And now last year, we can see on the right-hand side, what was the year-on-year decrease in the LCOE. So for PP, it was 13%, same as of offshore. Onshore a little bit higher, 15%. So this was in spite of supply chain disruptions that came related to, well, many issues, the multiple crises that are ongoing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also, the recent fossil fuel price crisis has only exacerbated the competitiveness of renewables against fossil fuels in many locations. So we'll be dwelling a little bit later as well around that. Let's take a look at this by technology. We'll start out with solar PV. Here you can see a chart of the key metrics of solar technology: the total installed cost, the capacity factor, and the levelized cost of electricity. So around a 21-fold growth during the 2010 to 2021 period for solar PV. So it's tremendous growth. Very high learning rate, above 30% for solar PV. That means that the LCOE declines by 30% for every doubling of the cumulative capacity. The total installed costs have also been declining quite heavily, as you see. Around 857 is the values you see in the thick lines are the global weighted averages. Also an important thing, as you see, is the narrowing of the range of costs, and has occurred. So this was the LCOE in 2021. Like I mentioned, was 13% lower than in 2020, and 88% lower than in 2010. Looking a little bit of what has been driving this, we can see that module costs have declined quite dramatically during the last decade. Here you can see different types of module costs that have been sold in Germany, in Europe. And now this is a little bit of the longer term view, which shows quite a lot of advances in the technology. Particularly, this has been driven by increase in efficiency for modules, as let's say more modern cell architectures have started to become dominant in the market. This represents a decline for crystalline silicon module prices of around 88% to 95%. So the weighted average is around 90% for that period. And this, the lower cost modules are around, were in December 2021, were around $20 per watt, whereas the high end ranges between 42 and 44 cents per watt. Now that is on the low, that is what happened at December 2021, but recently we've seen that supply chain disruptions have caused an uptick in PV module prices. So you can see here what has been changing year on year, and a little bit of the uptick mostly on mainstream module types. So you see that in the 2020 to 2021 period, increases of around 5 to 6% occurred in most categories. That's now has started to stabilize a little bit in the first half of 2022, where we have data, but we're still trying to complete that analysis to see what actually how it ended up for the full year of 2022. So the market has started to the supply and demand balance have started to stabilize, but there's still like in spite of this of increased module costs, the total cost reductions for 2021 still occurred among many markets, particularly a 4 to 11% reduction in the historical markets, which are China, India, Japan, Korea, US, and Germany. So these are like the bigger historical markets, but interestingly, still newer markets were showing very competitive cost structures. For example, in the Netherlands or Turkey, and this is part of what happened. The reason for this is that the module costs were not immediately transferred to the total installed cost level, because there's still a lag in and when these costs arrive at the total installed cost level and then at the LCOE level, right? We've been making an effort during the last years actually to try to understand better what the total installed costs are for solar PV. And that has meant making an effort to understanding the cost breakdown of solar PV costs. Here you can see here in blue the modules and the inverters, and then some of the other hardwares, racking and mounting, and other soft costs, installation costs and soft costs in yellow. So for modules and inverters, historically they've contributed large shares to the total installed cost, but that has been changing recently. As you see here, the module costs are not now the most important or the only big driver for the total installed cost. Another interesting thing that has happened is that there has been a convergence in terms of the differences among markets. So the cost level of the very high end of the markets and the very low end of the market, so has declined with time. So this ratio, for example, the high to low ratio was 3.5 in 2019, whereas now it's 2.9 in 2021, and it's likely that it's going to keep on reducing with time. The balance of system costs have contributed quite substantially. Here we can see the module decline. The module decline has contributed quite substantially to the 2010 to 2021 LCOE. So modules and inverters, EPC modules accounted for 45% of the LCOE decline. But if we take a look at other balance of system costs, in this view, there have not been such a big driver, because in the past, the share of module costs was very high in total installed costs. This has started to change in recent years, whereas module costs have become lower. And then if we take a look at this picture, like for the next decade, it will be looking totally different, because the balance of system costs will likely be contributing much more to the cost reduction potential at the LCOE level. Let's now move to the other solar technology, the concentrating solar power, or concentrating solar technologies, as it's sometimes called. So concentrating solar power is very interesting technology with very rapid improvement during the last decade, in spite of the quite low deployment actually that it has had. So the total market for CSP currently is around 6.5 gigawatts cumulative. But during the last decade, the period of 2010 to 2020, you can see that cost declined quite heavily, 68% decline in the levelized cost of electricity. This was driven mostly by solar field cost improvements as the technology improved with larger parabolic throw collectors, for example. As you see here, the performance has improved, and the aperture width has improved 24%. The very important thing that has happened in the market is that storage duration. So concentrating solar power technologies now almost exclusively come with storage, are built with thermal storage, mostly based on molten salts. And this, the duration of that storage has increased constantly in the future. It has also contributed to the improvement of the capacity factor, but more importantly, it allows for the technology to have more flexibility and to be able to supply 24/7 and to add value to the electricity system. Here we can see that taking into account the 2021, what happened in 2021. 2021 was very thin market with only one project, so this data needs to be carefully taken with care. But if we take a look at that, the trend was very clear that total installed costs continued to reduce. But of course, 2021 was an exception, because the Cerro Dominador project in Chile was quite on the high end of the capex. It was a project that was very delayed. Still, because it had a very high it is sitting at a location which has probably one of the best DNI, direct normal irradiance conditions in the world, then the capacity factor was around 80%, very high capacity factor, which still allowed for a very competitive LCOE, not far away from the 2020 global weighted average. So that trend still continued. CSP now is in the mid-cost range of new capacity, as opposed to solar PV that has undercut this cost range. But now CSP very competitive. Again, the outlook for CSP market is very promising now, with lots of plans in various locations coming up. And the ability, like I said, to add flexibility to the system and to make use of that storage. As you see here, the storage hours have increased quite substantially from 2010. The global average for all projects was 3.5. And of course, the Cerro Dominador project was 17.5. But even in 2020, the average was 11%. And now there's really no CSP plant that has not been built or planned with substantial amount of storage, probably larger than 7 hours, no matter the location. Let's move now to allow Sonia to tell us a little bit more about wind. So Sonia, floor is yours.
Thank you, Pablo. Next, please. Next. Yeah, thank you. Now we look at some key cost and performance metrics of onshore wind. The global cumulative capacity of onshore wind increased more than fourfold between 2010 and 2021, increasing from around 178 gigawatt to 769 gigawatt. And this increase has driven the decline in the global weighted average total installed cost by 35% for the same period. We can see here also the considerable increase in capacity factor, which allowed for onshore to have a very competitive LCOE. In fact, the LCOE of onshore wind had the lowest weighted average LCOE value in 2021 when compared to other renewable energy technologies, as we've seen earlier. It's important to highlight that around 69 gigawatt out of the 72 gigawatt that were added in 2021 had an LCOE lower than the cheapest new source of fossil fuel power generation. So that's important to highlight how competitive the onshore wind became. Next, please. Here we can see that the cost of wind turbine had been showing a declining trend, which has driven the decline in the total installed cost of wind projects. This can be clearly seen for China. By 2021, wind turbine prices had declined by 84% since its peak in 1998, in declining from around 2,580 US dollar per kilowatt to an average of just 425 US dollar per kilowatt. We can also notice the recent uptick in wind turbine prices, especially outside China. This can be seen in 2021 and into 2022 due to supply chain disruptions. This can suggest that the total installed cost might increase in 2022. Next, please. Here we can see the evolution of average turbine rating, rotor diameter, and hub height between 2010 and 2021 in some of the major wind markets, which resulted in an almost 1/3 of the improvement in the global weighted average capacity factor. Technically, larger rotor diameters increase the energy capture at sites with the same wind speed, and higher hub heights, they enable the access to higher wind speeds at the same location. That means expanding the range of suitable locations that we can use for wind turbines. Here, it's important to see how the increase of global weighted average capacity factor of onshore wind. It was also driven by the increase of deployment in countries with excellent wind resources, for example, like the United States or Latin America, and also the significant decline in China's onshore wind deployment. In fact, China only deployed 29 gigawatt in 2021, comparing to 69 gigawatt in 2022, and that's more than 50% decline. I like this chart because, I mean, basically, it's based on projects we have available in our database, and it shows major onshore wind markets and how they experience an increase in their weighted average capacity factor, despite the decline in weighted average wind speed when comparing projects between 2010 and 2020. And the overall trend across all these markets confirm that the technology improvements, they contribute greatly to the increase of the weighted average capacity factor. It's also important to mention that the decline in wind speeds, it's due to less access to better wind resources in some countries, but also in other countries, it's because of an improved economics of onshore wind, which allows projects to be built in areas with lower wind speeds, for example. Here we can see the global LCOE has declined 90% since 1984. And the factors behind this decline are mainly, as we mentioned earlier, the turbine technology improvements, economies of scale, which impacts the cost of manufacturers and installation. We also, there's the reduction of operation and maintenance due to digital technologies, which allows to an improved data analytics and autonomous inspection of turbines. And finally, the increased competitiveness in these markets as more players are entering the markets across the value chain. Next, please. And for this year's report, we also published the data, we reported data for what we call smaller onshore wind markets, as the improved economics of onshore wind has unlocked the growth in these newer markets. Now jumping to offshore wind, the decline in global weighted average total installed cost of offshore wind has been also driven by the increasing installed capacity globally, and this installed capacity mainly was deployed in Europe and China. So between 2010 and 2021, the cumulative capacity grew by 11-fold, increasing from only 3.1 gigawatt to almost 56 gigawatt. And here we can see the capacity factor in 2021 was at 39%. We can see the decline after 2017, where it was 45%. And this can be explained by the increased deployment in China, which has lower wind resources. For example, China deployed 17.4 gigawatt in 2021, which represents almost 85% of the newly added capacity, offshore capacity in 2021. Here we examined offshore wind projects, project characteristics, and we can see clearly that there has been a trend towards moving into deeper waters and further from shore in Europe and also in China and the rest of the world. Next, please. Just like onshore wind, improvement in technologies, including larger turbines, longer blades, and higher hub heights, along as also in addition to access to better wind resources due to moving the wind farms moving further from shore, that all resulted in an increase in the global weighted average capacity factor, and also a decline in the levelized cost of electricity, reaching to 7.5 kilowatt hour. Between 2010 and 2021, both Europe and China, the SOE of Europe and China declined by more than 50%. Next. Yes. Next. Not to forget about the mature technologies, hydropower, bioenergy, and geothermal. For hydropower in 2021, the cost of hydropower continues to increase. This is mainly driven by the increased number of projects with more expensive deployment conditions compared to previous projects, and that's notably in Asia. Capacity factor increased to 45%, and the LCOE increased by 23% between 2010 and 2021. For geothermal, we saw an increase in the global weighted average total installed cost, reaching to almost $4,000 per kilowatt. But it's very important to know that only 370 megawatt was deployed in 2021, which means the weighted average costs and performance are being determined by a handful of projects in each year. So it's important to look at it, to look at this data with care. Next. For bioenergy, between 2010 and 2021, there was 72 gigawatt added capacity, including the 9 gigawatt added capacity in 2021. We saw an 11% a year-on-year decline of the weighted average total installed cost, and capacity factor declined to reach 68%. The global weighted LCOE declined to 6.7 cents per kilowatt hour, and this is still at the lower end of the cost of electricity of new fossil fuel projects. Now, thank you. Moving back to Pablo.
All right, yes, just trying to summarize some of the key happenings. So in spite of the supply chain disruptions, renewables, the cost of renewable energy continued to decline in 2021. Of course, 2022 is a little bit of a different story. We're yet to find out how the supply chain trouble affected, but we're looking at the data very carefully now. Despite this, just the renewables that were installed in 2021 already are yielding huge benefits. So at least we calculated with some conservative assumptions for fossil fuel prices. We calculated at least 55 billion potential global net savings are to be obtained in 2022, just from the deployment that was installed in 2021 for renewables. Of course, other benefits are becoming increasingly important for countries are the renewables have the ability to free economies from volatile fossil fuel prices, curbs energy costs, reduce fuel imports, and apart from create tangible savings for communities, also a big job generator, which is part of other work streams of IRENA that you will also have an opportunity to hear about soon. So that's about it from our side. Martina, back to you.
Thank you. We are slightly running out of time, but let's take two questions. So one would be about inflationary environment, inflation. So why did we not see higher total installed costs in projects in 2021? Can you share with us, or can you give us your insights on that?
Maybe I'll just quickly take that one. So of course, we've already seen the effect of inflationary, like I mentioned, for example, for PV modules, and also Sonia mentioned for turbines. Now that there is a lag in the project cycle, let's call it that, in the value chain of renewables. So we still have not seen the full effect of that inflation at the total installed cost levels and at the, therefore at the LCOE level. We're monitoring it very carefully this year with this year data. And we've made some estimates already of how big this impact might be. So it's moderate as far as we see. But yes, it may be the case that costs in 2022, when we report the next report, we'll see some uptakes in some areas.
Great, thank you. And one more, and then I encourage the audience to send their message to Sonia and or their question to Sonia and Pablo at cost@irena.org. So the other question which came in the order is, how do you think the cost of solar PV modules will evolve? Sonia, Pablo, either of you. Thank you.
Right. Let me take that one quickly. So we're carefully monitoring as well the solar PV costs. Now, lots happening in terms of solar PV. It's a very dynamic market with a lot of technology evolution happening, lots of innovation. Cell architecture is constantly evolving, so it's sometimes an issue of how fast manufacturing ramps up in terms of the adoption of the new technologies, but efficiency will likely to keep on increasing. Now, of course, bifacial technologies are very important, and they are likely to become cheaper with time. So that will have a big effect on the LCOE level in many regions, right? We're looking to that very carefully, and in spite of the supply chain disruptions, and by the way, large part of this was some of those disruptions were because the polysilicon price has been really high lately, but capacity is ramping up very heavily with manufacturers. Now polysilicon is a very capex intensive industry, so it takes some time, but I think the industry is catching up quite quickly, and we'll see the demand supply imbalance be smoothened in the next years. The cost reduction potential for PV is going to continue to be quite interesting.
And I know that we are running out of time, but there are a couple of questions about critical materials. I don't know if, the questions are like, what are the factors that influence the reduction of cost, particularly given the extraction of metals is becoming more difficult? Do you have any insights of this, or we encourage people just to send you an email to
Right, this is increasingly becoming very important, and we at IRENA are working very hard on all these topics. This is intrinsically the industry is striving to move away from critical materials in their designs. You can see the issue, of course, of rare earth metals or rare earths in the magnets for wind turbines and other technologies such as EVs, of course, but also at the PV level. The innovations happening that improve efficiency without with diminishing at the same time critical materials. One classic is silver paste metals for PV, which has declined quite substantially in the last years, and it continues to decline. I mean, there's big efforts to reduce silver usage per watt in the PV industry, and there's like that. There's so many others effects, but yeah. Also, the sustainability is becoming very important as well for the industry and for the markets, of course, on the users' side. So definitely a very nice issue to explore further, and we're working on that.
Yeah, and just to encourage the audience, IRENA wrote the report on rare earth, particularly looking on permanent magnets in wind and EVs, about projections and innovation. So it's all on our IRENA website under education section. So please also, there is one on lithium, and there will be one coming on EV batteries, whoever is interested in the topic. So yeah, unfortunately, our 30 minutes or so is coming to a close. So I would like to thank you, Pablo and Sonia, very much for your time and for sharing with us the insights from your work on cost. We hope to again see you in a year when you will come back with more insights from the next year version. It's a lot of encouraging messages you shared with us. And I also would like to thank to all of you in the audience for joining us today, for listening and for your questions. And we hope that you learned something new. And just the next slide, please. About what comes next. In 2 weeks, we will have a webinar on powering agriculture food value chain with geothermal heat. The registration will open within a few days, and we hope to see you again there. So that is all from us for today. I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you again to Pablo and Sonia and to all of you for joining. Goodbye and see you soon.
Thank you, Martina.
Bye-bye.
Bye.